Hey everyone, Julian here again, just trying to do another video response on a book I finished called Socrates by Paul Johnson. And I thought it was a really interesting book, and to introduce some topics to everyone about how Plato kind of misrepresented or used Socrates as kind of a Frankenstein creation of his own in order to voice his own opinions, and how a lot of the stuff that he actually said was not really captured in Plato's Republic as well as we wanted it to be, but that there are other sources out there that actually were uh, capable of giving us a better interpretation of who this person might have been in ancient Greece. So to begin with, the author makes a couple comparisons between Socrates, Ezra, and Confucius, the three great thinkers, all in their way that they valued education, the way that they went about their lives, and in the sense that Socrates believed that the only reason that people do bad is because they don't know any better because of a lack of education, and believed that the way to self-knowledge was one of the keys to living a better and more fulfilling life. Socrates wrote nothing, as well as Confucius didn't really write anything that wasn't that was. I personally didn't write it down, but Xenophon wrote memoirs, and Xenophon was one of his students, by the way, who wrote memoirs, including a dinner party featuring Socrates, in which we can get a better picture, and if we combine it with the Republic and with other sources, we can get a better sense of who this person was or might have been. Our chief source is Plato, which is a delight and a misfortune according to the author, because some records from the Apology, for example, from Plato, are verbatim uh, from Socrates about what he said. But as well, there is also a lot of things that are said through Socrates in kind of a Frankenstein kind of monster way that he's been misrepresented in order to push Plato's ideas instead of Socrates' ideas, which actually are quite different from each other. So, in a sense, as the author suggests, Paul Johnson, he says that Socrates may have died twice, in the sense that he was executed by the court, but he was also used kind of as a fictional character almost in order to represent Plato's views of the forms, and it really doesn't give justice to the character. As a teacher, Plato used Socrates to convey ideas, uh, now voiced Plato's ideas instead of his own in the dialogues. So Plato thought he was doing Socrates a great service and doing philosophy a great service by putting his ideas forward and using such a reputable, known character at the time in Athens in order to tell these stories. But uh, Plato created almost like a Frankenstein living doll monster of artificial philosophy that really doesn't represent a lot of the ideas that Socrates had. So it kind of loses out on that part. Where Plato stops and Socrates begins is hard to tell. It's really there's two other characters that are important to to understand. That there's that are really three sources that are really good, and I'd say Aristophanes, and who wrote a play about Socrates called Clouds, and Xenophon, who was a former student, and then signed up with the Spartans for some reason afterwards and became a warrior. But both of them have written extensively on Socrates, and usually are not taken into account in the actual teaching of who Socrates is. Like when I took a course in university on Plato and Socrates, it really didn't talk about Aristophanes or Xenophon to the degree that I wanted it to. Like they did bring them up, but they didn't actually go in depth into to differentiate between the three different accounts and to find the similarities between the three, and then those would probably be more likely to be Socrates rather than the Frankenstein creation of plate sock, as Paul Johnson expertly describes. So there's another problem too, is that the problem of interpretation and translation of his ideas as well. A lot of the stuff may have been lost over time or reinterpreted or translated wrong, and there's a lot of stuff that may have been destroyed as the Library of Alexandria was burned, and Aristotle's private library was donated there, and like all these things could have been there that we don't actually have as all of the evidence, considering the translations and the other problems of surviving the passage of time. So Socrates was born in Athens. He loved Athens, and he only left once to be a soldier to defend the place that he loved. He His conduct in battle was courageous, so he was definitely described as a feared soldier and a capable philosopher in both ways. So it kind of gives you a kind of different impression than the old man in the cloak, and you don't really, you think that he's weak and he doesn't have really any kind of control or really about the world or any knowledge of anything other than kind of abstract philosophy. But that's totally not the case, and not how he was not how I anyways interpreted how he was represented by Plato. Um, so Socrates had a good opinion of women, unlike Plato. He had a good opinion of wives and mothers, and in Plato's Republic, he describes in the Symposium, he describes, which is a dinner party meeting between a whole bunch of characters in Plato's Republic, and Socrates among them, in which they all take turns describing the meanings of life and talking about these discussions. And um, Diotima is a philosopher. We're not really sure if she's a real person or not. Like, there is some evidence that she existed, but it's controversial. That and Socrates in the Symposium describes how Diotima influenced him by describing to him the idea that the point of childbirth is immortality, because uh, it lets you live on through your children genetically, metaphorically, and in a certain way, it's carrying on through those children. So it's a striving for immortality, and I tend to agree with this perspective, especially after reading an essay by Ernest Becker called "The Denial of Death," which I agree with as well. That the idea that almost all human activity is a denial of death, and or a postponement or an attempt to postpone such shuffling off of the mortal coil, so to speak. So we have to talk about Aristophanes as well, who wrote a play about Socrates, who it was kind of a scathing play to begin with. Like, it presented him more as a sophist instead of a philosopher, and sophists are just philosophers who use emotional arguments rather than searching for the truth or trying to make the weaker argument stronger, as it was said against him by Miletus in the trial. And there was a whole bunch of problems with the way that Socrates was represented by Plato, because Socrates, there's not a lot of evidence that Socrates actually believed in the utopias and the world of the forms, where there was a perfect heaven of forms somewhere where a perfect version of everything existed. And Plato had these very abstract metaphysical philosophical beliefs. And a really good way of describing Socrates in contrast to this would be the way that Cicero described him, which I got from a book by Cicero called On Living and Dying Well, which is the idea that Socrates was one of the first to bring philosophy out of the stars and out of the clouds and bring it down into the homes of people. And it's a really interesting way to describe it, because he was more concerned about the good life and about the questions of good and evil and purpose, and things that were more important to the common people, to everyone, not just abstract philosophers living in ivory towers. And then there's also another topic that requires discussion, which is the reason that Socrates was executed was that a lot of his ideas were actually contrary to the way that society was run, and it's not exactly the same as the elitist kind of philosopher king's concept that Plato was suggesting, which is more of a kind of an elite system, basically, where the people are decided. The guardians are this, and then the philosopher kings are that, and everyone has an assigned role. It's almost like Adam Smith's capitalism, where everyone has a specialist, and everyone's a specialist in a certain way. But it really made it difficult for me to understand after when I took the Plato course in philosophy, because it presented Socrates basically as a mouthpiece for Plato's ideas, and I really felt like that was disingenuous after reading a couple books beyond the course, because even though I actually, the teacher was great, and he really did ask us, what do you think that this is what he said, and you think that's what it was about? And at the end of the course, I agreed that I didn't think that that's what he was supposed to be, and I thought that he was manipulated in many ways. But then I think that Paul Johnson basically took this idea of Socrates being this plate sock Frankenstein character, a shape-shifting kind of character who is part Plato, part Socrates, And I agree with him in so many ways, but the only thing that I kind of took issue with in this book was when he tried to make a lot of biblical comparisons between the character of Socrates and Christianity, which I do have a problem with because Socrates was about 400 BC before the year zero. So it really doesn't have anything to do with Christianity. If anything, Christianity probably borrowed from Socrates and from some of the Eastern religions and other religions like the Roman religion that were around them and the Jewish religion all around them at the time that they were. So it's a situational combination of all of the other ones as well. And a lot of the religions are a composite of good ideas and bad ideas. But I think that Paul Johnson doesn't. I mean, he does say that it's not a profit. It's not profitable to make a. It's not efficient or profitable to really make comparisons between or to search for comparisons between Socrates and between Socrates and Jesus, but he kind of does make it out to be like Socrates was like sacrificing himself, as this character, as the Jesus type character for the good of the people, or so the sins of Athens can be worn away, and Aristotle does describe it too. He says, the first the, killing Socrates was a sin against philosophy. It was Athens' first sin against philosophy, and I will agree that like there are some comparable things between Socrates and Jesus, but I really don't think that it's a good comparison. And I think that even though he suggests that that's not the case, I think that he's still kind of leaning in the direction that somehow, in some way, Socrates is like, or he would even agree with Christianity in any way, shape, and form, which I disagree with because he was clearly not had no idea about it. There's no way. The time periods do not conflate, do not even mix with each other. So I think that it's really useful in order to understand the character of Socrates in Plato's writings, and also the character of Socrates in Xenophon's and Aristophanes' writings as well, because the similarities between them are more likely to be the character of Socrates than it is to be than the things that Plato makes up, because he, like I said, he was using Socrates as a believable figure, as a public, figure in order to disseminate his ideas, but it's disingenuous to a certain degree. So anyone who wishes to engage with Socrates in the future should probably do a little bit of excess reading beyond the Republic and beyond, the mainstream conceptions, even beyond the book itself that I just read, beyond Socrates by Paul Johnson, because it's necessary to move away from this idea of trying to conflate him. Because first he says, oh, well, we don't want Plato to be conflated with Socrates, and I totally agree. But we also don't want Socrates to be conflated with religious Christianity, which is 400 years later. So I think that it really is a difficult issue, but it deserves a lot more research. And if there's anything that anyone else wants to add to this or correct me on, I'd be happy to deal with it. Thank you very much for your time. Have a good day.